Okay, this is the first lecture of the Kubrick, second Kubrick film that we're doing this term, which is Dr. Strangelove, um, which is a very famous film. This first section, then and now, because you need to have a bit of a you need to have a bit of background to understand sort of more of what's at play in this particular film. This film comes from early in the Cold War, the first Cold War. So remember that the Cold War essentially is a war that was fought between the Soviet Union and America and the Allies from World War One, World War Two. So essentially, what we now recognize the Five Eyes, basically. But France, Germany, well, West Germany, um, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, the whole of the UK actually, and what was then the Commonwealth, the European Commonwealth, pardon me, the United Kingdom, and America, the NATO and its allies, and so in 1946, when the hot war stopped, basically a struggle began between for information, for world dominance, to put it bluntly, between the two forces, of communism and the Soviet Union, and the USSR, which is Russia at the center, with all of its acquired properties that it acquired during World War II as part of the settlement of how to divide Europe up after World War II. And so that meant that the Soviet Union, Russia, basically took hold of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, half of Germany, that is East Germany, Poland, and so on. And these became what were called satellite countries or buffer zone countries, because basically they produced a physical barrier between the West and the East, and this was the so-called Iron Curtain, where behind the Iron Curtain it was unknown. Well, it wasn't really unknown, but anyway, you couldn't just walk in and then come out again. If you were from the West. So any of the countries that I mentioned, including Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, the Netherlands, Belgium, you couldn't just walk in to the Soviet Union and its satellites and expect to just come back out. You might disappear and you might not return, and so on. So there was a fight on between these two forces for the planet, but the fight wasn't a hot one, and this is why it's called the Cold War. So there is a basically the world plunges into this Cold War where there is a fight, but it's all cloak and dagger, and this is where all the espionage stuff comes up, and this is why John le Carré is so important, because of the spy who came in from the cold, and other spy novels and so on, which give a early picture of basically what the private war is that's going on. And it's not as though there aren't hot wars that are fought. There are so-called proxy wars are being fought in all kinds of places. Some of them are colonial. Some of them are between essentially the Allies and the Soviet Union. They're just not declared because they're limited to a particular country. So, okay. Things then thaw out a little bit after the Cold War gets colder and warmer, depending on who's in charge. When Stalin is in charge in the Soviet Union, it's very cold. And then, although Stalin had these connections with FDR and Churchill, so maybe it wasn't so cold. And then Khrushchev came in and it got very cold indeed. And it looked as though there was going to be a nuclear war. By the time we get to the 60s, which is where this film is set, there are a number of nations in what's the so-called nuclear club. Okay, there's a little bit of a background. the stuff you need to know to understand the references in the film, and I'll point them out as we get to them. So you just sort of keep this in your in your keep this in your gym bag, kind of thing. Is that the Nikita Khrushchev will become the premier the same way that I was going to say the same way that Putin is now the premier. That's not actually accurate, because the Duma has been massively remade. The organization of the Duma has been massively remade. But the argument is that the Russian oligarchs effectively have reproduced a great deal of the Soviet era leadership, where it's leadership by very wealthy people who are very, very powerful. Anyway, so Nikita Khrushchev arrives as the Soviet premier, which means he's basically the leader of the East, of the Soviet communism, as opposed to increasingly Chinese communism as China becomes a world power. China is not a world power at this point. It's just struggling through its own revolution, 1947. So we're not there yet. But by 1953, Khrushchev comes in, and he will stay in for 11 years, between 1953 and 1964. And this film will come out then. So the premiere that essentially is Premier Kiss Off, which really just means fuck off. The kiss off was the sort of 50s and 60s slang for fuck off if you didn't want to say fuck off to somebody. He said, kiss off. Or he's kissing us off, that kind of thing. It was a euphemistic way of saying fuck off. So he's in power, and it's a Cold War, and so it's very nerve-wracking when Khrushchev decides to put missiles in Cuba, and so he places supposed to be nuclear tip missiles in Cuba. Kennedy says we're going to blockade Cuba, and we're going to force Khrushchev to withdraw these missiles, or we're going to have a war. And for 13 days, there is the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is the coldest moment. It is apparently the moment where we get the closest to a nuclear war that we have yet had. There actually have been a number of close calls. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, depending on how you count. And I'll give you some examples of those. But for the moment, let's just stay focused. So Khrushchev will appear, and he will show up in the film as Premier Kissoff, who will be played. We only ever hear him on the phone, and he's played on the phone by Peter Sellers. That was the notion originally, that he would play Premier Kissoff, and that would have given him 4 roles in the film, because Peter Sellers plays Dr. Strangelove, he plays the President, Merkin Muffley, and he plays Group Captain Lionel Mandrake with a mustache, who tries to coax General Jack D. Ripper to give him the command code so they can recall the wing. So, at the same time, in this same period, is the onset of McCarthyism. By 1953, McCarthyism is in full flood, and McCarthyism basically looks like Trump, effectively. McCarthy is this big slob who wanted to get reelected, and he just wanted to gain power. So he was looking around for an issue, and his aide said to him, "Why don't you go after communists?" And he's like, "Are there communists in America? We don't know, but who cares? Just say there are." So he started saying, "There are communists. I have a list," and he kept talking about this list that he had of communists, and especially there were communists, he said, in Hollywood, and people believed him. In the same way that he gaslighted the whole country, basically, and nobody took him aside and said, "Show us the proof or you're done." But that didn't happen until he went up against the army, which happened in 1954. So McCarthyism is finished at the point we get to the film, but it absolutely informs what's going on, because although McCarthy is set aside as a senator, he's a senator from Wisconsin, and he loses power. I mean, that's it. He goes up against the army. That's it. You can't take on the army. And they finish him off. But the anti-communism and the hunting of communists and red baiting and red scares and so on, this is the third red scare, actually, in America's history. And it's the most severe. And it's very, very bad. And it looks not unlike we just came through with Trump, which is why it's so nerve-wracking that there are 74 million people who voted for this guy, because basically if there are that many crazy people around, presumably they are ripe for further inflammation through gaslighting, basically. So if you want to, you just need to use the right, you just need to find the right person who can essentially turn a crank on on a conspiracy theory and catch these people up. And so it moved from, this, at first it was this, and then it was that, and it was white supremacists, and then it was QAnon, and they're also white supremacists. Okay, basically it's bad news. And it's bad news for everybody who isn't white, fundamentally white and wealthy, white male and wealthy, white straight male Christian and wealthy. Okay, a little bit of modification there. The same kind of thing just happened before this film.